Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story. A story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through a winter wonderland, where the air is crisp and snow blankets the ground like a soft, endless quilt. The trees stand tall, their branches dusted with frost, and the world is wrapped in a serene, icy silence. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel warm and heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? Close your eyes if you haven't already, and let this story guide you into a restful, deep sleep. Here's the beginning of the story based on the title The Silent Frost of Montana's Backwoods. It was late December 1998, the week between Christmas and New Year's, when the frostbitten silence of Montana's backwoods held the kind of chill that seemed alive. The small town of Bridger sat nestled between endless pine forests and snow-draped hills, its residents hunkered down against the fierce winter storm that had rolled in a few days earlier. Rachel Donovan, a 32-year-old schoolteacher, had driven up from Bozeman to spend the holidays at her late uncle's cabin. The cabin stood deep in the woods, a good 12 miles from the nearest neighbor. It was rustic, with a stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and walls lined with antlers and faded photographs. Though she had inherited it years ago, Rachel rarely visited. Her memories of the place were tinged with unease, especially after her uncle's unexplained disappearance in those very woods 7 winters ago. The snowstorm had worsened that evening, and by 7 p.m., the world outside the cabin was a swirling chaos of white. The electricity flickered twice before the power went out completely, leaving Rachel in the flickering glow of a single oil lamp. She piled logs into the fireplace and settled in with a thick quilt, trying to ignore the eerie quiet that blanketed the forest. First, it was peaceful. The crackle of the fire, the occasional howl of the wind. It was the kind of solitude she thought she wanted. But as the hours passed, a strange sense of unease began to settle over her. The silence outside seemed too perfect, too heavy, as if the snow had swallowed all the sounds of life. Even the wind seemed to have died down. At 10:13 p.m., she first heard it. A faint, deliberate knock at the door. Rachel froze. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and the snowstorm made it impossible for anyone to have walked there. She grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door, her breath visible in the cold air. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob, and called out, "Hello? Who's there?" There was no response, just the sound of the wind picking up again, faintly whistling through the cracks in the wood. She turned the knob slowly, opening the door a few inches. The flashlight's beam cut through the swirling snow, but there was no one there, just the thick snowdrifts and the skeletal outlines of trees. But as she stepped back to close the door, she noticed something that sent a shiver down her spine. Faint footprints leading up to the porch. They weren't human. They were long and narrow, with claw-like impressions at the tips, and they stopped abruptly just a few feet from the door. Rachel slammed the door shut, bolting it with shaking hands. She tried to convince herself it was just an animal, a deer or perhaps a stray dog, but the pattern of the tracks lingered in her mind, almost humanoid, but not quite. As the hours stretched on, the knocks returned, always faint and irregular, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew she was listening. By 2 a.m., Rachel was huddled by the fire, clutching the hunting rifle her uncle had left behind. Every creak of the cabin seemed magnified in the silence. Every shadow cast by the fire danced with sinister intent. Then came the whispering. First, she thought it was the wind, but the sound had an unmistakable cadence, like words she couldn't quite understand. It seemed to drift through the walls, low and guttural, growing louder with each passing moment. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The whispering stopped. And then, from the back of the cabin, she heard the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as the sound of the footsteps moved across the back of the cabin. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the crackling of the fire. Slowly, she turned the flashlight toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms, its narrow beam piercing the darkness. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Her hands were clammy as she gripped the rifle, the cold metal digging into her palms. She forced herself to take a step forward, her wool socks muffling her movement on the wooden floor. The hallway stretched ahead, shadows pooling in the corners where the flashlight didn't reach. As she approached the first door on the left, the guest bedroom she hadn't touched since arriving, she noticed it was slightly ajar. She was certain it had been closed earlier. The air in the hallway felt colder, sharper, as if the frost outside had seeped into the very walls. With the rifle raised and her flashlight trembling in her other hand, Rachel nudged the door open. The room was empty, save for the twin bed with its moth-eaten quilt and an old rocking chair by the window. The chair faced outward, its back to her, but it was swaying gently, creaking with each movement. The hair on her arms stood on end. The window was closed, the latch secure. There was no draft, no reason for the chair to move. "Whoever's here, leave now," she shouted, her voice echoing in the small space. The rocking stopped. She held her breath, waiting, but the silence was so profound it made her ears ring. As she backed out of the room, the flashlight flickered, casting distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and twist along the walls. Then she heard it again, the whispering. This time, it was louder, closer, coming from the far end of the hallway. It was no longer guttural. It had formed words. "Rachel! Rachel!" Her name, spoken in a raspy, almost mocking tone. She stumbled back into the main room, her panic rising. Slamming the door to the hallway shut, she dragged a chair in front of it, as if that would keep whatever was out there at bay. The whispering continued, faint but persistent, slipping through the cracks of the cabin like smoke. Desperation clawed at her chest. She grabbed her coat, boots, and car keys. She couldn't stay here. Snowstorm or not, she had to leave. But when she threw open the front door, she stopped cold. The footprints were back. The same clawed impressions, but this time they didn't just lead to the porch, they circled the cabin. Dozens of them, fresh and impossibly precise, as if the creature had been walking in circles for hours, waiting. Rachel's flashlight flickered again, the light sputtering before going out completely. She slammed the door shut, her back pressed against it as the darkness swallowed the cabin. The whispering grew louder, echoing from every corner of the room, each voice overlapping with the next. Then came the knock. This time it wasn't faint or hesitant. It was sharp, deliberate, and impossibly loud. The entire door rattled under the force of it. "Rachel!" The voice rasped again, from just beyond the door. Tears blurred her vision as she gripped the rifle tightly, her knuckles white. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know if she could survive the night. And then, the voice spoke again, clearer this time, almost human. "Let me in." Rachel shook her head violently, her back pressed harder against the door as if sheer force alone would keep the voice, and whatever it belonged to, outside. "No!" she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. Silence fell again, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. The fire in the hearth began to dim, as though the warmth itself was being drained from the room. Shadows crept along the walls, stretching toward her like they had a life of their own. Then came the scratching. It started softly, like fingernails dragging against the wood of the front door, but it grew louder, more aggressive, until it sounded like claws raking against the cabin's exterior. The sound moved around the doorframe, along the windows, even on the roof. Whatever was outside was circling the cabin, relentless and unyielding. Rachel's mind raced. She fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal, of course. There wouldn't be this deep in the woods, especially in a storm. Her car was buried under a thick blanket of snow, and even if she could get to it, the storm would make driving impossible. She was trapped. Her gaze darted to the rifle in her hands. Would it even work against this? Whatever this was. The scratching stopped suddenly, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Rachel's breathing was shallow, her ears straining for any sound. Then, a soft tapping came from the window nearest the fireplace. She turned slowly, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the dark. The window was frosted over, but there was a faint outline on the other side. A face. It wasn't fully visible through the frost, but it was pale, unnaturally so, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. The shape of its mouth was wrong, too wide, with teeth that gleamed sharp even through the icy barrier. "Rachel," it whispered again, the voice muffled but unmistakable. She stumbled back, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. The face moved closer to the glass, its breath fogging the pain as it whispered again, "You can't hide forever." Rachel screamed, raising the rifle and firing a shot toward the window. The sound was deafening in the small space, and for a moment, she thought she'd hit it. The glass shattered, cold air rushing into the cabin. But when she dared to look, the face was gone. The whispering, however, had returned, this time louder, and it wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was inside the cabin. Rachel spun around, her flashlight sweeping the room, but she saw nothing. The shadows danced on the walls, mocking her, and the voices grew more insistent, overlapping in a cacophony of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come back," one voice hissed. "This is his place now," another added, its tone dripping with malice. Rachel's chest tightened as the room seemed to close in around her. The cold was unbearable now, her breath coming out in ragged clouds. She backed up against the fireplace, the only source of light left, and held the rifle in front of her like a shield. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of something stepping into the room. The floorboards creaked under the weight of whatever it was, deliberate and slow. Rachel swung the flashlight wildly, but the beam flickered and failed again, plunging her into near-total darkness. "Show yourself," she screamed, her voice raw. The footsteps stopped, just inches away from her. And then, in a voice that sounded like a twisted version of her uncle's, it whispered, "Welcome home." Rachel froze, her blood turning to ice. That voice, she recognized it. It was unmistakably her Uncle Henry's, but distorted, hollow, as if spoken through a broken ancient radio. Her legs threatened to give out beneath her, but she clung to the rifle, her knuckles white. The footsteps began again, slow and deliberate, circling her as the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. She swung the flashlight back on, its faint beam catching only glimpses of movement. Something tall, too tall to be human, its limbs elongated and jagged, its form barely visible in the flickering light. "No," Rachel muttered under her breath, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. "You're not him. You're not him." The thing paused, just out of the light, its silhouette flickering as if it didn't fully belong to this world. Then it spoke again, the voice shifting between her uncle's and something far darker, deeper, more ancient. He was mine, and now you are too. The whisper sent a cold rush through her body, colder than the frost outside. Rachel fired another shot blindly into the darkness, the deafening sound echoing through the cabin. The shadows seemed to retreat for a moment, and for a fleeting second, she thought she might have hit it. But then the laughter began. It wasn't human. It was layered, guttural, and shrill at the same time, coming from everywhere at once. The walls of the cabin groaned as if under immense pressure, and the floor beneath her feet began to vibrate. Desperation clawed at Rachel as she backed toward the door, her mind racing. She had to get out, into the storm, into the woods, anywhere but here. The rifle felt useless now, a fragile piece of metal against something far beyond her understanding. As her hand reached the doorknob, she felt a sudden, icy grip on her shoulder. It was impossibly cold, like bare skin pressed against frozen steel. She turned her head slowly, her breath hitching, and came face to face with it. The thing loomed over her, its features shifting like smoke in the firelight. Its face was almost human but wrong. Its eyes were black voids, its mouth stretching too wide with rows of jagged teeth. It leaned closer, its breath reeking of decay, and whispered in her ear, "You can't leave, Rachel. The frost will find you." Summoning all her strength, Rachel screamed and swung the rifle like a club, the butt of it connecting with the thing's face. It let out an ear-piercing shriek and staggered back, its form flickering like a dying light bulb. Seizing the moment, Rachel yanked open the door and ran into the snowstorm. The wind was ferocious, biting at her exposed skin and nearly blinding her with thick, driving snow. But she didn't stop. She didn't dare look back. The forest loomed ahead, the towering pines swaying ominously in the wind. She stumbled through the deep snow, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, the whispering returned, louder now, following her into the woods. "Rachel," the voices called, echoing through the trees. Her flashlight flickered again, the beam cutting through the storm just enough to reveal the faint outline of a trail ahead. She recognized it, the old hunting path her uncle had shown her as a child. She clung to it as her only hope, forcing her legs to keep moving. But then, just as she thought she was gaining distance, she heard it again. The footsteps. They were heavy and deliberate, crunching through the snow, far too close behind her. She dared a glance over her shoulder and saw them, those clawed footprints appearing one by one in the snow, as if the creature were invisible but still leaving its mark. "Leave me alone!" she screamed into the storm, her voice barely audible over the wind. But the thing didn't stop. The whispering grew louder, and the forest seemed to warp around her, the trees twisting into grotesque shapes. The trail began to disappear under the snow, and for a moment, she thought she saw faces in the bark of the trees, watching her with hollow eyes. Finally, she stumbled into a clearing, her legs giving out beneath her. She collapsed into the snow, gasping for air, the cold biting through her coat and into her skin. The whispering stopped, and the forest fell eerily silent. For a brief moment, she thought it was over. But then, from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, the thing emerged. It was fully visible now, towering and impossibly thin, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its face twisted into something resembling a grin, its empty eyes locked onto hers. Rachel tried to crawl backward, but the snow was too deep. Her body was failing her, the cold sapping her strength. The creature leaned down, its face inches from hers. "You can't escape the frost," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "It will claim you as it claimed him." Rachel's breaths came in short, sharp gasps as she stared into the creature's hollow, black eyes. It was so close now that she could feel its icy presence pressing down on her, heavier than the snowstorm raging around them. Her body trembled uncontrollably, both from fear and the biting cold. She reached for the rifle, but it was buried in the snow behind her, just out of reach. The creature tilted its head, as if amused by her struggle. Its grin widened, revealing more of those jagged teeth. It didn't need to speak again, its intent was clear. But then, in the faintest glimmer of hope, Rachel remembered something. Her uncle's journal. She had found it earlier that evening, tucked away in a drawer by the fireplace. It had been filled with strange, rambling notes about the cabin, the woods, and something he referred to only as the Frostkeeper. She hadn't read it all, but one thing stood out. Fire keeps it at bay. With a surge of adrenaline, Rachel fumbled in her pocket and found the lighter she had taken from the cabin before fleeing. Her frozen fingers barely managed to flick it open, but when the small flame sputtered to life, the creature recoiled, hissing loudly. Its shadowy form flickered like a dying flame, its grin twisting into a snarl. "Stay back!" she screamed, thrusting the lighter toward it. The creature hesitated, its elongated limbs twitching as if uncertain. Taking the chance, Rachel scrambled to her feet and stumbled backward toward the center of the clearing. Her mind raced. She needed more fire, something bigger, something that could drive it away for good. Her eyes darted around the clearing until she saw it. A fallen pine tree, its branches dry and brittle under the thick layer of snow. She ran to it, her fingers numb as she yanked the lighter toward the exposed bark, frantically trying to ignite it. The creature was advancing again, slower this time, as if testing her resolve. The first few sparks fizzled uselessly, but then a small flame caught. Rachel grabbed a handful of dry pine needles and fed the flame, shielding it from the wind with her body. The fire grew, crackling to life, and the warmth gave her a renewed sense of purpose. The creature let out an ear-splitting shriek, its form rippling like smoke in the heat of the fire. It backed away, but it didn't leave. Instead, it circled the clearing, its black eyes locked on her, waiting for the flames to weaken. "You can't hold it forever," the voice whispered in her mind, now sharper and more malevolent. Rachel ignored it, feeding the fire with everything she could find: branches, bark, even pieces of her own coat. The flames roared higher, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. For the first time, she saw the creature clearly. Its form was skeletal, its flesh translucent and frostbitten, and its movements were unnervingly fluid, like water frozen and thawed repeatedly. The fire forced it to retreat to the edge of the clearing, but Rachel knew this was temporary. The storm raged on, snow falling faster now, threatening to smother the flames. Her thoughts turned to her uncle's journal again. He had written something else about the creature, something about the Frostkeeper's bond to the land. It thrived on isolation, on fear, on those who dared to stay too long in its woods. She wasn't just dealing with a creature, she was dealing with its domain. "I have to leave," she muttered to herself, her voice shaky. But how? The snow was too deep, and she didn't know if she could find her way back to the cabin in the storm, let alone the road. She glanced at the creature again, which now paced like a predator waiting for its prey to falter. And then she remembered something else. The matches in her uncle's hunting pack, still back at the cabin. If she could make it back, she could light the fireplace again, strengthen her defense, and maybe even figure out a way to destroy the Frostkeeper for good. "I have to try," she whispered, steeling herself. Clutching a burning branch from the fire, she turned and began to run, the flames flickering wildly as the storm howled around her. The creature let out another shriek and gave chase, its movements unnaturally fast, its clawed feet crunching through the snow. Rachel didn't dare look back. The cabin was her only hope. But the deeper she ran into the woods, the more the forest seemed to shift around her. The trees twisted unnaturally, the trail disappearing under fresh snow. The whispering voices returned, louder now, mocking her, taunting her. "You won't make it," they hissed. The light from the burning branch began to dim as the wind howled harder, threatening to snuff it out completely. Rachel's lungs burned from the cold, her legs heavy with exhaustion. Just as she thought she couldn't go any farther, she spotted it. The faint outline of the cabin through the swirling snow. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. The creature was closing in, its claws slicing through the air as it lunged toward her. Rachel screamed and threw the burning branch behind her. The flames flared briefly as they struck the creature, causing it to recoil with a guttural roar. She used the moment to stumble up the porch steps and fling open the door. She slammed it shut behind her, bolting it as the whispering voices surrounded the cabin once more. The fire in the hearth was nearly out, but she ran to it, frantically feeding it more logs. Her shaking hands grabbed the matches from the pack, striking one and reigniting the dwindling flames. Outside, the creature howled, its rage reverberating through the walls. But Rachel didn't stop. She piled on more wood, the fire roaring back to life, and grabbed the journal from the table. Her eyes scanned the pages, desperate for answers. And then she found it. A single line, written in shaky, hurried handwriting. Asterisk, the Frostkeeper can be bound, but only if its name is spoken into fire. Asterisk, the name. Her uncle must have known it. But where? Where would it be? As the walls of the cabin groaned under the pressure of the storm, Rachel flipped through the journal, her heart racing, and then, scrawled on the very last page, she found it. The name was written in uneven, jagged handwriting that seemed to tremble off the page, as if her uncle had scrawled it in desperation. Nerthos. Rachel stared at the word, her lips trembling as she repeated it under her breath. The moment she did, the storm outside intensified, and the walls of the cabin shuddered violently. The Frostkeeper's howling voice rang through the air, its rage palpable. "You dare speak my name?" The voice thundered, no longer whispering but roaring, filling every corner of the cabin. The shadows on the walls writhed as if alive, reaching toward Rachel like grasping hands. She stumbled back toward the fire, clutching the journal tightly in one hand and the matches in the other. Her uncle's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, can be bound, but only if its name is spoken into fire. Asterisk. Rachel dropped to her knees by the fireplace, her heart pounding as she whispered the name again, louder this time. Nerthos. The fire surged, crackling violently, and the whispering outside ceased for a moment, replaced by a guttural growl. Rachel didn't stop. She grabbed another log and fed it to the flames, her voice growing stronger. Nerthos, I bind you. Nerthos. The cabin shook as if an earthquake had struck, and the Frostkeeper's piercing wail tore through the air. The shadows in the room twisted and condensed, swirling toward the fireplace like a vortex. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the walls and her breath freezing in the air. The creature appeared again, this time inside the cabin. Its skeletal frame towered over her, its clawed hands reaching for her as the firelight danced across its translucent, frost-covered form. Its face twisted in fury, the jagged teeth bared as it let out a roar that rattled the windows. But Rachel didn't falter. She reached into the fire itself, pulling out a burning piece of wood, and held it high. Nerthos, I cast you out. The flames erupted, blazing higher than they ever should have. The creature reeled back, its form distorting and flickering like a flame in the wind. Its claws slashed wildly at the air, but it couldn't move closer. "No!" It screeched, its voice cracking like ice. "This is my domain. You cannot take it from me." Rachel gritted her teeth, her fear replaced by a surge of determination. She plunged the burning wood back into the fire, feeding the flames with everything within reach. More logs, the remains of an old chair, even her uncle's journal. The creature let out one final, ear-splitting wail as the fire roared, consuming the shadows and filling the cabin with blinding light. Its form broke apart like shards of ice, scattering into the flames and disappearing into nothingness. The storm outside stopped instantly, the howling wind replaced by an eerie, absolute silence. Rachel collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. The cabin was still. The fire crackled softly, its light warm and inviting now, as if the darkness had been banished completely. For a long time, Rachel didn't move. She simply lay there, staring at the flickering flames, her mind numb. Slowly, she pulled herself to her feet and approached the window. The snow outside was untouched, pristine and glittering in the moonlight. The clawed footprints were gone. The forest stood silent and still, as though the storm had never happened. Rachel exhaled shakily, her breath fogging the glass. She had survived. Somehow she had survived. But as she turned back toward the fire, her eyes fell on the journal's scorched remains. Among the ashes, one word remained, burned into the paper like a brand: beware. Rachel stared at the single word etched into the charred remains of the journal. Asterisk, beware. Asterisk, her stomach turned as the meaning sank in. Had she truly defeated the Frost Keeper? Or had she only managed to drive it away temporarily? The warmth of the fire no longer felt comforting. It felt fragile, fleeting, as though the safety it provided could vanish at any moment. She paced the cabin, her mind racing. The storm was gone, the creature had been banished, or so it seemed, but something still felt wrong. The silence outside was too heavy, too unnatural. Even the usual creaks of the cabin had ceased, as if the entire world was holding its breath. Rachel decided she couldn't stay there. She needed to leave the woods, find help, and get back to civilization. The thought of driving back down the treacherous mountain road in the dead of night was terrifying, but staying in the cabin felt worse. She threw on her coat, grabbed her uncle's hunting pack, and loaded the rifle again. The door creaked open, and a blast of cold air greeted her. The snowstorm had left behind a frozen wonderland, the trees glistening under the light of a full moon. The cabin stood like a tiny speck of warmth in an otherwise desolate landscape. Rachel stepped outside cautiously, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. The forest was silent, save for the occasional crack of ice breaking off branches. She scanned the treeline, half expecting to see the Frost Keeper lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing, just the stillness of winter. She trudged toward the trail leading to her truck, her every breath visible in the cold air. The path was barely discernible under the thick blanket of snow, but she remembered the way well enough. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The sensation grew stronger the farther she went. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, but there was nothing there. Her unease mounted with every step, and her grip on the rifle tightened. Then, she heard it, a faint crunching sound behind her. Rachel froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound came again, deliberate and slow, as though someone or something was following her. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. She turned around fully, the rifle raised, but the trail behind her was empty. The snow was untouched, no footprints but her own. Swallowing hard, she pressed on, quickening her pace. The crunching sound resumed, closer now, matching her steps. She stopped abruptly, and so did the sound. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as she scanned the forest. And then she saw them, not in the snow, but in the trees, shadows that shouldn't have been there, shapes that shifted unnaturally. The Frostkeeper's words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, the frost will find you. Asterisk. Rachel broke into a run, her boots slipping on the icy trail. The whispering voices returned, faint at first but growing louder, surrounding her. Rachel, stay. You can't leave. She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to drown them out, but they only grew louder, their tone mocking and cruel. The shadows moved closer, their forms barely distinguishable as they flitted between the trees. Her truck came into view, parked at the edge of the trail where the woods gave way to the open expanse of the mountain road. Relief surged through her, and she sprinted the last stretch, throwing herself toward the driver's side door. She yanked it open, jumped inside, and slammed the door shut, locking it in one fluid motion. Her hands fumbled with the keys as she jammed them into the ignition. The engine sputtered, refusing to start. "No, no, no!" she cried, turning the key again and again. The shadows began to emerge from the treeline, their forms now fully visible. They weren't the Frostkeeper, but something else, smaller, more numerous, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. The engine roared to life just as the first of the creatures reached the truck. Rachel slammed the gear into drive and hit the gas. The tires spun for a moment before catching, and the truck lurched forward, leaving the clearing behind. She didn't look back. The mountain road was narrow and treacherous, the snow and ice making every turn a gamble. The whispering followed her, carried on the wind, growing fainter as she descended. By the time she reached the base of the mountain, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. The forest had vanished into the distance, and the whispering was gone. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't escaped entirely. The Frostkeeper's words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder. The frost will find you. And as she pulled into the safety of a small town, the first signs of frost began to creep across the edges of her truck's windows. Rachel parked her truck in front of a small diner on the edge of the town, its warm neon sign flickering against the pale dawn. Her hands shook as she turned off the engine, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The frost on the windows had begun to melt under the growing sunlight, but the chill in her chest wouldn't go away. She stumbled out of the truck and into the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air, a stark contrast to the icy fear she still carried. A middle-aged waitress with kind eyes and a notepad in hand approached her, concern etched on her face. "You all right, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Rachel opened her mouth to respond but couldn't find the words. Instead, she sank into a booth near the window, her body trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. The waitress poured her a steaming cup of coffee without asking, placing it gently in front of her. "Take your time, sweetheart. No rush." Rachel clutched the mug with both hands, letting the warmth seep into her frozen fingers. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. She wanted to tell someone, anyone, about what she had seen, but how could she explain it? How could she describe the Frostkeeper, the shadows, the voices? Her gaze drifted to the frost creeping along the edges of the window. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. Her stomach tightened as she watched it slowly etch delicate, unnatural patterns in the glass. "More coffee?" the waitress asked, startling Rachel out of her thoughts. Yeah, thanks," Rachel replied, her voice shaky. The waitress gave her a sympathetic smile and refilled the cup. "Where you coming from?" "Not a lot of folks head down this way in the winter." Rachel hesitated. "I was staying in a cabin. Up in the mountains." The waitress raised an eyebrow. "Up near Pine Hollow?" Rachel nodded. "Not a good place this time of year," the waitress said, her tone suddenly serious. She glanced around as if to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in closer. "They say those woods are cursed. Folks go missing up there. Always have." Rachel's blood ran cold. "You've heard about it?" The waitress nodded grimly. "Everyone around here knows the stories. My grandpa used to say there's something in those woods that doesn't want people there. Called it the frost." She straightened up, her expression softening. "But, those are just old tales. Probably just the cold and snow playing tricks on folks' minds." Rachel forced a weak smile, but her hands tightened around the coffee mug. She wanted to believe it was all in her head, a nightmare brought on by the isolation and the storm. But the frost on the window said otherwise. The bell above the door jingled again, and Rachel flinched, her heart racing. A man in a heavy coat walked in, stomping the snow off his boots. She watched him warily, half expecting to see glowing eyes or unnatural movements. But he was just another local, nodding to the waitress as he took a seat at the counter. Rachel turned back to the window. The frost had grown thicker, the patterns more intricate, almost like writing. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to make out the faint lines. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized what it said. Asterisk, you cannot escape. Asterisk. Rachel's body went rigid, the mug slipping from her hands and spilling coffee across the table. The waitress rushed over. "Honey, are you okay?" Rachel didn't answer. She bolted out of the booth and out the door, the cold morning air hitting her like a wall. Her truck sat where she'd left it, the frost now spreading across the windshield in jagged, unnatural lines. She backed away, her breaths coming in panicked gasps. The whispering started again, faint but unmistakable, carried on the icy wind. "Rachel!" The town around her seemed to fade, the sound of cars and distant voices muffled, as if she were being pulled back into the forest. "No!" she screamed, clutching her head. The frost crept toward her, covering the ground in a thin, glistening sheet. The shadows were returning, stretching out from the edges of the street, their forms flickering like the remnants of a dying fire. Rachel turned and ran, not knowing where she was going, only that she couldn't stop. The whispering grew louder, the frost chasing her like a living thing, hungry and relentless. As she rounded a corner, she saw it again. A figure standing in the middle of the street, tall and skeletal, its hollow eyes watching her with cruel amusement. The Frost Keeper. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The creature tilted its head, its jagged grin widening. "You can run," it whispered, "but the frost will always find you." Rachel's legs refused to move, as if frozen by the very presence of the creature. The streets around her seemed to warp and bend, the shadows of the town twisting into nightmarish forms, stretching toward her like cold fingers. The Frost Keeper stood tall and imposing, its skeletal figure a silhouette against the faint glow of the streetlights, its black eyes gleaming with malice. "You cannot escape, Rachel," it whispered again, its voice like ice scraping against stone. "The frost is eternal." Her heart pounded in her chest, but a surge of adrenaline snapped her from her paralysis. The creature had come to claim her, to drag her back into the woods, back into the darkness. But she wasn't ready to give up. With a shaky breath, she turned and ran, not looking back. Her boots thudded against the pavement, her breath coming in gasps, visible in the frigid air. The sound of the creature's footsteps echoed in the distance, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it catch her again. She reached the edge of the town, the small buildings and houses now just shadows against the mountain's looming presence. The frost had begun to spread through the streets, its icy tendrils creeping along the ground and up the sides of the buildings. Rachel pushed herself harder, her legs aching, her lungs burning. The wind howled in her ears, and the whispering voices grew louder, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. "It's coming for you. You can't hide." Rachel's eyes darted around. The road ahead seemed endless, the trees of the forest just beyond the town's border. She knew that if she reached the forest again, the Frostkeeper would have her. But where could she go? The town was swallowed by the night, and every building felt like a trap. Every shadow held a threat. Suddenly, a flicker of light caught her eye. A house at the very edge of town, its porch light glowing warmly. Without thinking, she sprinted toward it, her only thought to seek refuge, to find safety. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she knocked. A man appeared in the doorway, his face worn with age but kind. "You all right, miss?" he asked, concern written on his features. "What's going on out there?" Rachel didn't answer. She shoved past him into the warmth of the house. "Please," she gasped. "You have to help me." The man stepped back, clearly taken aback by her urgency. "What happened? What's chasing you?" Her eyes darted nervously to the windows, but the house appeared to be safe for now. She leaned against the wall, trying to catch her breath. "It's the Frostkeeper. There's something in the woods. It follows you, haunts you, and it's coming for me." The man didn't seem to understand. He shook his head, looking at her like she was delirious. "Now hold on. I don't know what you're talking about. There's nothing out there but snow and trees." But Rachel could see it. His expression had changed, his body tense. A flicker of recognition passed across his face, as if he had heard the stories before, as if he knew exactly what she was talking about. He closed the door behind them, locking it with a low click. The wind howled outside, the frost spreading quickly up the window panes. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "I know what you're talking about. I've lived here long enough to hear the old stories. But you can't run from it forever." Rachel's eyes widened. "What are you talking about? You've seen it?" The man hesitated before answering. "It's been here for generations. This town, the woods, they're bound together. The Frostkeeper is part of it. It's always been here, lurking in the cold." Rachel's blood ran cold as she processed his words. "So, it's not just me? People know about it?" The man nodded grimly. "They know, but they don't talk about it. People go missing, yes, but the frost takes them. And the frost always finds its way back to those it wants." Rachel's stomach twisted. "You mean, there's no escaping it?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned to the window, peering out into the growing storm. "The only thing you can do is survive long enough for it to forget you." The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. Rachel's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. She had thought she was done, escaped, but now it seemed like she was trapped in an even worse nightmare. "I don't care if it forgets me," she muttered, her voice shaking. "I just want to live. I'll do anything." The man turned back to her, his face grim. "Anything?" He gave her a long look before continuing. "Then you'll need to do something that's never been done before. Something dangerous." Rachel met his eyes, her resolve hardening. "What is it?" He stepped back into the shadows, pulling something from a shelf. An old, rusted lantern. "This lantern is the key," he said quietly. "It's an old relic, but it might just be enough to push the Frostkeeper back. For good, Rachel felt a strange mix of hope and doubt. How do you know? The man paused, staring at the lantern as if it held 100 unspoken truths. I've seen it used once, many years ago when the frost was at its worst. But it's a dangerous gamble. The lantern can only work if you light it in the heart of the storm, in the exact place where the Frostkeeper first appeared. It's not a guarantee, but it's the only chance you have. Rachel's heart raced. The thought of facing the creature once more, to enter the very heart of the storm, terrified her. But she had no choice. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "I don't care what it takes." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then take the lantern. Go to the woods, to the clearing where the creature first showed itself to you. You must light the lantern there and say its name into the flames. But the Frostkeeper, it's your only hope." He handed her the lantern. "Now go, and be ready for whatever comes next." Rachel clutched the lantern tightly, the cold metal seeping into her palm. The weight of the task ahead pressed down on her chest. But there was no turning back now. The frost was already creeping in, spreading its tendrils through the house and onto the floor like an insidious tide. The shadows outside were deepening, growing hungry. She didn't need to look at the man to know that he was watching her. His expression a mix of grim understanding and silent warning. He knew what she had to face, but there was no sympathy in his eyes. In this town, survival came at a steep price. Rachel turned on her heel and bolted out the door, the biting wind slapping her face as soon as she stepped into the street. The storm was returning, more ferocious than before. Snow swirled in thick gusts, and the temperature dropped, the frost crawling up her legs as she ran. She didn't know where the clearing was exactly, but she had a gut feeling it would reveal itself when the time came. The lantern flickered dimly, its light weak against the oppressive darkness that surrounded her. Every shadow felt alive, reaching for her, the whispers starting again, swirling through the howling wind. "Rachel," the voice was familiar now, always just on the edge of her hearing, like a memory she couldn't fully recall. She wanted to ignore it, to press forward, but the whispers tugged at her, telling her that she was too late, that she was already lost. But she kept moving. The snow crunched under her boots, each step an effort as the frost threatened to overtake her. The world seemed to narrow, the trees closing in around her like a cage. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and the lantern's flame wavered with every gust of wind, as if on the brink of being extinguished. Then she saw it. Through the swirling snow, a clearing appeared ahead, an open space surrounded by towering trees. The frost had already begun to gather here, coating the ground in a shimmering layer of ice. The air was thick with the cold, but it wasn't the same as before. It was heavier, as if the very atmosphere was alive with the creature's presence. The Frostkeeper's howl echoed through the trees, deafening and filled with rage. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to step into the clearing. The lantern's flame flickered again, then steadied as if sensing the power in the air. "Nerthos," Rachel shouted into the wind, her voice trembling but determined. "I bind you. I cast you out." The air grew still. For a moment, the world was quiet, the storm pausing in mid-roar. The ground beneath her feet cracked open with a deafening sound, and from the chasm that split the earth, the Frostkeeper rose, its towering form emerging from the shadows, its jagged skeletal face filled with fury. "You think you can banish me?" The creature growled, its voice like the grinding of ice. Its claws scraped the ground, sending sparks of frost flying. "You cannot escape the frost. It is a part of you now." Rachel raised the lantern high, the flame now burning bright and steady despite the howling winds. She felt the heat of it, the warmth pushing back against the freezing air. The Frostkeeper recoiled, its black eyes narrowing. "You think you have power over me, mortal?" it hissed. "This land is mine. I have claimed it for centuries." Rachel didn't falter. She held the lantern up, her hands trembling but steady. "I know what you are. I know what you've done. This ends tonight." The Frostkeeper's laugh echoed through the clearing, deep and menacing. "You cannot destroy what is already eternal." Rachel stepped forward, her breath a cloud in the icy air. "I don't need to destroy you. I just need to banish you. The frost doesn't belong here anymore. Not in this town, not in these woods. It's over." She spoke the words of the binding, her voice steady and clear. As she did, the frost beneath her feet began to crack, the ground trembling with the weight of the creature's fury. The lantern blazed brighter, the flame now reaching toward the heavens, casting an otherworldly light across the clearing. The Frostkeeper shrieked, its form flickering as if it were made of smoke. Its clawed hands reached out toward her, but the light of the lantern burned brighter, pushing it back, forcing it to shrink, to retreat into the darkness from which it had come. "You can't escape me," the Frostkeeper hissed, its voice fading. "I will always return." "Not this time," Rachel whispered, her voice low but filled with the strength of every person the creature had taken over the years. The light of the lantern burst with a blinding flash, and the Frostkeeper was gone. The storm stopped instantly, and the snow fell in soft, peaceful silence. The frost began to melt, the chill lifting from the air, and the clearing was still. For the first time since she had arrived in the woods, the world felt normal. Rachel dropped to her knees, exhausted but alive. She could still feel the cold in her bones, but the threat had passed. The Frostkeeper was gone, vanquished for now. The binding had worked. As she looked up at the sky, the first rays of dawn pierced through the clouds, warming the earth. The storm had passed, and the sun began to rise over the mountains. But Rachel knew the truth. The frost had not been eradicated. It was simply waiting for the right moment to return, and she would be ready. Rachel stood, the weight of the moment sinking in. The clearing was eerily quiet now, the storm having dissipated with the defeat of the Frostkeeper. But there was an unsettling stillness to the world around her. The frost that had once clung to everything was receding, but its presence lingered, like a memory that wouldn't fade. She glanced at the lantern, still glowing faintly in her hand, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold that had nearly consumed her. But as she stared at it, a thought crossed her mind. How long before the Frostkeeper found a way back? How long before the frost returned to claim more lives, more souls? Her breath fogged in the air as she turned to leave the clearing, the silence pressing in from all sides. The path back to town seemed less welcoming now, as if the woods themselves were whispering, warning her not to return. The wind had picked up again, but it was different, darker, more insistent. The lantern's glow flickered one last time before dimming. Rachel held it up, staring at its faint light. She had succeeded in banishing the creature, but it hadn't been destroyed. The Frostkeeper was a force, an entity bound to these woods, these mountains. And as long as it remained, so too would the frost. As Rachel began her journey back to town, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, a shiver running down her spine. Her every step was echoed by a rustling in the trees, faint whispers that seemed to follow her through the snow-covered path. And then she heard it, soft at first but growing louder. The whispering. "Rachel." She stopped dead in her tracks, her heart thundering in her chest. She spun around, the lantern casting long shadows across the snow. The clearing behind her was empty, save for the thin layer of frost that still clung to the earth. But the air felt heavy. Too heavy. It wasn't just the wind she was hearing. It was the frost keeper. She wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of the town, to forget the nightmare she'd just survived. But something deep inside her told her that if she didn't face this now, it would follow her forever. The creature would never let her go, not until it had its final say. "Come back," the voice whispered again, colder now, colder than it had been before. "You belong to the frost, Rachel." Rachel's pulse quickened, but she steeled herself. She knew she had to finish this, had to make sure it didn't return. She raised the lantern once more, its weak light flickering against the encroaching darkness. The frost crept up the trees, slowly, as if the woods themselves were coming alive, answering the creature's call. "No," Rachel muttered under her breath. "You're not taking me." With all the strength she had left, she stepped forward, her boots crunching in the snow as she walked back into the heart of the clearing. The wind howled louder now, carrying the voice of the frost keeper, as if trying to drown out her thoughts, to break her resolve. But Rachel refused to let fear consume her. She knew that the frost keeper had been banished, but banishment wasn't enough. It wasn't over until she made it impossible for the creature to return. She stepped into the very center of the clearing, where the frost was thickest, and held the lantern high. The shadows twisted around her, reaching, clawing at her as if they wanted to pull her into the depths of the earth. But Rachel focused on the flame, steadying her breath, grounding herself in the task at hand. She spoke the words again, her voice stronger this time. "Nerthos, by the frost and the flame, I bind you." The ground trembled beneath her feet as the air grew cold, colder than it had ever been. The whispers intensified, swirling in her ears, but Rachel didn't flinch. She continued, her voice unwavering. "You are nothing but a shadow, a remnant of the past. Your time is over. The frost will not claim this land. Not anymore." With each word she spoke, the ground around her cracked and shifted, the frost retreating in waves. The lantern's flame blazed brighter, casting long, stark shadows across the clearing. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the tremors stopped. The wind died down. The frost vanished. Rachel stood there, heart pounding, the silence of the clearing settling around her. For the first time, she felt the weight of exhaustion in her bones. She had done it. The frost keeper was gone, for now. But something inside her told her that it wasn't truly over. The land was still bound to the creature, and while she had pushed it back, she hadn't severed the connection. There would always be a part of the frost here, lingering, waiting. As Rachel turned to leave, the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, casting a soft, golden light over the snow-covered ground. The woods were silent, peaceful. The storm had passed, and the air felt lighter, as if the land itself was breathing again. But as Rachel made her way back to town, she couldn't shake the feeling that the frost wasn't done with her. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next time the storm would rise. Rachel walked back toward the town, the first light of dawn filtering through the trees, casting soft hues of pink and orange across the snow. It was a peaceful sight, one she hadn't seen in weeks, but the calm felt hollow. The frost had retreated, but the chilling realization gnawed at her that the battle wasn't truly over. She could feel it now, that presence in the woods, the one that had followed her all this time, watching from the darkness. It wasn't gone, just biding its time. And Rachel knew better than anyone that the Frost Keeper was not an entity that could be erased or forgotten. It was part of this land, as old as the mountains themselves, and it would always find its way back. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of town bells, marking the early hour, their chimes clear and reassuring. As she neared the outskirts of town, Rachel saw the familiar houses, still cloaked in the early morning frost, their chimneys sending tendrils of smoke into the sky. The town, with its small streets and sleepy charm, looked unchanged. But Rachel was not the same. The frost keeper had marked her, and she could feel the weight of that presence lingering in the back of her mind. It would always be there, a shadow she could never outrun. She passed the old church on the edge of town, its stone walls covered in a thin layer of ice. The bell tower stood tall, a stark silhouette against the awakening sky. She paused for a moment, taking in the sight, then continued toward the inn. As Rachel approached the door, she felt a strange unease settle in her chest. The town had been safe, hidden from the worst of the storm, but that didn't mean it was free from the frost. She could feel the whispers in the air, the cold creeping back, inching its way through the cracks. When she stepped inside the inn, the warmth of the hearth met her, a sharp contrast to the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The familiar scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air, and the quiet hum of conversation buzzed in the background. A few townsfolk were gathered around the fireplace, sipping warm coffee and chatting, none of them aware of the nightmare Rachel had just survived. The innkeeper, a kindly woman named Mabel, smiled at Rachel as she entered. "Morning, dear. You look like you've seen a ghost." Rachel managed a weak smile, though the exhaustion in her eyes was evident. "I've seen worse." Mabel raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. Instead, she gestured to the table near the window. "Come sit, have some breakfast. You look like you could use it." Rachel nodded, grateful for the moment of normalcy. She crossed the room and sat at the table, her hands still shaking slightly as she wrapped them around a mug of warm tea. The heat from the cup seeped into her skin, but it couldn't chase away the cold that had settled deep inside her. As she sipped the tea, she felt the presence again. The same cold, the same eerie silence that had followed her in the woods. She looked up, scanning the room, but no one seemed to notice. No one seemed to feel it but her. Then, in the corner of the room, a familiar face caught her eye. The man from the edge of town, the one who had given her the lantern, was sitting at a table near the back. His eyes were fixed on her, and there was something in his gaze, something knowing. Rachel's heart skipped a beat as their eyes met. He nodded slightly, as though acknowledging her presence, but his expression remained unreadable. There was no smile, no greeting, just a silent understanding that passed between them. After a long moment, Rachel stood and made her way over to him. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to him, as though something inside her was telling her that he knew more than he was letting on. "Morning," she said, standing next to his table. "You're still here." The man didn't look surprised, but there was a flicker of something like pity, in his eyes. "I knew you'd come back," he said softly. "I knew the frost wouldn't let you go." Rachel frowned, her unease growing. "What do you mean?" I thought I stopped it. I banished it." "You did," he replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But you can't banish something that's always been here. The frost is a part of this place. It's not just a creature. It's the land itself, bound to the mountains, to the woods. You may have pushed it back, but it's not gone." Rachel felt her stomach churn. "Then what do I do?" The man's eyes softened, a sad understanding in them. "You can't fight it forever. The Frostkeeper will return, and each time, it will be stronger. The only way to truly rid yourself of it is to sever the connection between the frost and this land." Rachel shook her head. "How do I do that? I can't keep living like this, waiting for it to come back, waiting for it to claim me." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the other townsfolk, unaware of the darkness that had begun to stir again. "There's a way," he said quietly, "but it's dangerous. It requires something the frost can't touch." Rachel leaned in closer, her heart racing. "What do I have to do?" The man's expression was grave. "You need to leave. Leave this place. Break the connection, break the land's hold over you. But to do that, you must let go of everything. Your ties, your memories, everything that binds you to this town." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. "Leave? But I can't just leave. This is my home. This is where I belong." The man's gaze darkened. "If you stay, it will never stop. The frost will always find you. It will always be a part of you." Rachel felt the weight of his words press down on her. A final, crushing truth that left her breathless. She had fought so hard to survive, to push the darkness back. But the darkness was not something that could be defeated. It was part of the world around her, and if she stayed here, it would never let go. She stood up slowly, her heart heavy, her mind reeling with the impossibility of the choice before her. Leave everything behind? Could she do that? Could she walk away from the only life she had ever known? But she knew in that moment that if she didn't, the frost would never let her go. It would always follow, always haunt her, until there was nothing left of her but a shadow in the snow. With a final glance at the man, Rachel turned and walked out of the inn, her heart aching with the weight of the decision she had to make. And as she stepped into the frigid morning air, she knew that her journey was far from over. The frost would always be a part of her, but whether she chose to fight it or run from it was a choice only she could make. Rachel walked through the town, the streets quiet in the early morning. The frost on the rooftops sparkled like diamonds, and the world felt still, too still. She felt a weight pressing on her chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe, hard to think. The man's words echoed in her mind. "You can't fight it forever." She had always thought of this town as her home, a place of warmth and familiarity. She had grown up here, had friends here, and built a life among these familiar faces. But now, that life seemed like a fragile thing, something easily shattered by the presence of the frost, something the creature had claimed long ago. The woods, the mountains, they were part of the land's curse, and that curse had found its way to her. As she walked, her boots crunching softly in the snow, Rachel came to the edge of town. Beyond, the dark, brooding forest stretched out like an ominous sea, its trees standing tall and still under a blanket of frost. She could feel it, that pull, the same pull that had driven her into the woods in the first place, the same pull that had forced her to confront the frost keeper. Could she leave? Could she leave everything behind? Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to find a way to stay. But deep down, she knew there was no staying. If she stayed, the frost would never stop. It would consume everything. She could feel its tendrils creeping beneath her skin, waiting, always waiting. Rachel stopped at the edge of the woods, staring into the dense thicket of trees. The sky above was pale, the sun still hidden beneath the clouds, and she could hear the faint whispering of the wind through the branches. The frost keeper was not truly gone, it was never gone. It was a part of the land, and it would always find a way back, no matter how far she ran. She thought of the man at the inn, his sad, knowing eyes. He was right. There was no staying. Not if she wanted to survive. She had to sever the connection. She had to leave, and she had to do it now before the frost found a way to twist her into something unrecognizable. But leaving meant more than just walking away. It meant abandoning everything she had known, everything she loved. Her friends, her family, the memories she had built here. It meant leaving a life that had once felt safe, leaving it behind for something unknown, something uncertain. The cold wind picked up, swirling around her, and Rachel took a deep breath. She couldn't stay. The frost would never let her. It had claimed this place long ago, and it would claim her if she let it. With one last look at the town she had grown up in, she stepped forward, leaving behind the warmth and comfort of the familiar. She knew it wouldn't be easy, nothing worth doing ever was. But it was the only way. As she walked into the woods, the snow seemed to whisper her name, the wind carrying with it the same chilling voice that had haunted her since the beginning. But Rachel didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had crossed the threshold now, and there was no turning back. Days passed. The storm had passed. The town had carried on, unaware of what Rachel had done. The frost that had gripped their world for so long would eventually settle into a distant memory, a legend told around warm hearths during the coldest winters. But for Rachel, it would never be forgotten. The woods, the frost, the creature that had haunted her, would stay with her forever. The choice she had made would echo in her soul for as long as she lived. She had left. She had severed the bond, broken the land's hold over her. But the frost was not just a physical thing. It was a curse, a force that couldn't be banished entirely. It would wait, as it always had, and Rachel knew that one day it would return. But for now, she was free. The frost had not claimed her, and it wouldn't, at least not today. And so Rachel walked on, through the snow, away from the town, away from the life she knew. Her journey had just begun. And though she didn't know what lay ahead, she understood one thing clearly. The frost would always find its way back. And when it did, she would be ready. The silent frost of Montana's backwoods came to an end, but for Rachel, her battle had only just begun.